This episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto has been serving the energy needs of upstate New York since 1937. They're a fourth-generation family-owned business that has prioritized dependability, reliability, and integrity. If you have energy needs, call DeSanto and tell them we sent you. Visit DeSantoPropane.com to learn more. And by the Fox family of dealerships on Route 5 in Auburn. Check out their vast inventory of new and used cars by visiting foxdealerships.com. For FLX1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is episode 214 of the Inside the FLX podcast. Today I am joined by Dr. Scott Noren. He is running for Congress in New York's 23rd District, which includes the Southern Tier and a couple counties here in the Finger Lakes. Doctor, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Nice to see you, Josh.
So I guess let's start with the easy stuff. Tell us a little bit about yourself. A new face, I think, for a lot of folks here in the Finger Lakes. Who may not have been totally plugged into the last election cycle.
Sure. It's kind of ironic because I really started out, I lived in the Chicago area, and eventually after doing residencies and training and years of doing all kinds of healthcare training and becoming an oral surgeon, and then I was in the Army for 6 years. So I got out and I did a couple associateships. One was in Minnesota, and one was in Saratoga Springs, and then I finally made my way to Ithaca. But it's ironic in this particular election cycle because I interviewed on public TV 3 of the candidates in the previously, so I got to meet them before. I got to meet Max and Ian and Tracy and interviewed all 3 of them. And I didn't really come up with like a final determination of who I really liked the best. I actually liked Eddie Sundquist a lot, although I didn't get a chance to interview him beforehand. But I'd been always active with the school board meetings, and I was definitely a part of my Tompkins County Democratic Committee for years, and so I was still plugged into politics. I just hadn't run for anything, and then I did sort of a pseudo run for U.S. Senate, like as a write-in around the state, and it was more to bring awareness to like where did the real lobby money come from that funds even some Democratic campaigns? And that happened to be Senator Gillibrand, and that kind of bristled some people, but I really wanted to bring to light, if you're going to be a progressive, you really shouldn't take, gobs, millions of dollars of fossil fuel company money. Just like Bernie said to, I think it was Hillary, something like, you're taking all this money, you got to expect that people are going to think that you're taking it for a reason. Mm-hmm. It's not just an accident. And so I really wanted to help try to clean up some of the Democratic Party, do my little part by doing that, by bringing sunlight to things.
So when folks ask you why are you running this time, what's your answer? How do you approach that question?
Well, there's the life and death question, and that has to do with the opioid epidemic. I've been, practicing for about 30 years or so as an oral surgeon since 1997. And I've been a miser as far as prescribing opioids throughout that whole time, even before this crisis. But I've been in touch with the Attorney General's office up in Rochester about trying to really close down some of the pill mills that are still going on. And some of these are illegal pill mills. They're just actually pseudo-treating chronic pain, but there's no endpoint. They just do a lot of narcotics for these patients. And I have a commercial out right now where it says basically, this is what 1,480 oxycodone tablets looks like, and I pour them out of a pitcher basically. Mm-hmm. And it's still and that's my old doctor actually who's prescribing that, the one who I kind of wrote off after a while. I stopped going to him, not for narcotics, but because it didn't mesh, the relationship. Yeah. So. That's the life or death issue, but there's all kinds of other issues. The one issue, I look at healthcare as a right. I have a commercial out that says, Tracy doesn't believe that healthcare is a right in the United States, and it should take some kind of constitutional amendment to do that. I don't agree with that. I am kind of aligned with the Bernie campaign as far as that goes, that it is a right. As far as how to pay for it, I have a little different stance. And I see it as a tripartite kind of issue. The basic issue for healthcare in the United States in the most immediate concern. And here's how it goes. You have all the people that are on Medicaid, and they're covered, and they're doing okay, although they still are treated like second-class citizens because they're not being covered for certain things that people with fancier policies are covered for. But it is what it is. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Affordable Care Act, which is sort of the unaffordable care act. I pay $1,474 a month for mine. Even though I'm a vet and I'm still trying to get VA care, I'm still in that process. So then there's the people in the middle where the gap is. And that's where a lot of the argument is of how to get those people on the rolls for health care. They can't afford the Affordable Care Act premium, but they're not, at the Medicaid level. And I see it as, the state, even Cuomo and some other people in the legislature, well, we'll just raise taxes on the rich. And of course, you're going to drive more people out of the state, raise property taxes. There's an alternative, and it's ironic because George H.W. Bush, a Republican, came up with a luxury tax a long time ago. And who repealed it? Bill Clinton, corporate Democrat. Mm-hmm. So he was a Democrat, but he was a corporate Democrat, just like Hillary. And unfortunately, President Obama, who allowed the insurance companies to write the Affordable Care Act. So if you do a consumption tax, which we're proposed right now to spend about $197 billion on the old list of luxury items for 2020. That's the estimated forecast for how much we're going to spend on luxury items. I think it could be added to. I think we could easily get to close to $225 to $250 billion a year on luxury items to be taxed, and use some of that money to pay for the gap for the Medicaid ineligible people. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not going to be the complete cure, but it's going to sure be less painful because it's going to be spread out, and you're not going to raise people's property taxes or their income taxes and all the other things. So I see myself as having some novel ideas to help solve some of these problems. Those are the two biggies. Mm-hmm. I mean, the opioid issue and healthcare basically for all, essentially, and finding some way to get healthcare to everybody. Not everybody quotes like Canada's system as being perfect, and it's not. It has flaws. They're on a quota system. Mm-hmm. So you could be a doctor in Canada, and then they'll tell you, well, you've used up all your hours to work. Now your patients are going to have to go to some other provider for a month. You have to go on a mandatory vacation. Most people don't talk about that. I don't like that system, the quota system, because I think what happens if all of a sudden you need your doctor, now you're supposed to go to some other person that you don't even know from a hole in the wall. Mm-hmm. So there's some things that we need to tweak on the Canadian system. And there's a lot of other issues. I mean, you obviously you know them, and I'd be happy to talk about them too.
It sounds partly like what you're talking about is a little bit half creating new system, but also kind of expanding what the ACA does or was intended to do.
Right.
Do you think that's a little more of a palatable way of approaching the healthcare issue as opposed to taking what's perceived as a very radical stance like some folks
Yeah, I mean, part of me feels that urge to do a radical move like Bernie's talking about, but I just don't think the debt that it would create is really huge. There would be a huge cost savings, no doubt, with no premiums, no per person and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It's just that I think if you combine that with capping premiums on the Affordable Health Care Act and getting rid of copays and co-insurances and things like that, doing some of those things that he wants for Medicare for All, I think that's a stepping stone to having, we could eventually have a system, but there's also another impediment. People need to take care of themselves better. And, I myself, I have to struggle with trying to do cardio, doing aerobics and stuff like that, or some kind of, exercise. I was an athlete for my whole life. I went from track and field to powerlifting to Olympic lifting. I was in the World Masters Championships in Germany in 2016. But then I eventually found out that I had a back issue. I had a bulging disc. I didn't know about it. Mm-hmm. Finally got diagnosed. And so that kind of took me out of it. But we really need to have low-cost or no-cost fitness centers for even elderly and older folks, too, community centers. They can't afford the Island Fitness or the fancy schmancy kind of place. It's just not doable for people. And even for them to have, maybe you get a tax break for buying an exercycle for your house or doing something, some novel way to, like, maybe you can't go to a gym, or you don't have time to go to a gym. Part of that is you're working 2 or 3 part-time jobs, which we need to kind of address too. So we need to have a healthier public, and that will also bring us to the point where we can afford to have a healthcare for all, because we'll bend that cost curve. But we also have to have some novel ways to pay for it. And I think the consumption tax makes more sense because it's a lot less painful.
And given your experience in the healthcare industry, I have to ask, how has that sort of seeing it every day, seeing the system, the way it works presently every day, played into how you feel about it now, and where the biggest opportunities are?
Well, for the longest time, I was a slave to the insurance industry, and I built my practice up by being a provider, taking less money from patients, basically by being a participant. I'm a union healthcare provider, been a Teamsters provider for a long time, so I've dealt with a lot of union members. I'm hoping that the unions kind of will back me too, only because I've been a very loyal healthcare provider for them for years. But I've also given away a lot of stuff too. I mean, my fee sheet already is really low compared to my colleagues as it is. But, they know me at the front desk. They sometimes yell at me like, yeah, just charge this, or just cut this. I do that all the time. And there are some times where I just do stuff for free because it's less painful than doing some other kind of paperwork that, maybe somebody's Medicaid and I don't take straight Medicaid. And so I'm like, well, we'll just try to get you through this, whatever. So there's a little push and shove between, really doing the right thing and getting people healthy. And you are a business. People say this as a dirty word, that healthcare is a for-profit business. Well, being a healthcare provider is a for-profit business. It is. It's not a dirty word because that's what you train to do, and you get paid for it. Yeah. Where it becomes ugly is the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry. It makes it ugly. So I've learned to be compassionate, even more so than how I was raised. I learned to be more empathic for people's situation and I think that's rubbed off in problem solving for other things. I've given advice to my patients, go to junior college first and then go to regular college. It'll cost you less money. So I don't see people as just patients. I see them as, my fellow human beings.
So, and this is going to bend well into some of the other topics that we're going to talk about. A lot of people talk about prevention, and especially in the healthcare field, how important that is. But unfortunately, if you get into some of the more rural parts of the 23rd District, or frankly, anywhere else in upstate New York, primary care doctors are hard to come by. Not as many folks practicing family medicine as there once were. And a lot of these practices are sort of at their full. They're not really able to take on more patients. How does that part of this issue, access to care, play into the whole healthcare problem beyond the sort of X's and O's of insurance and how that works?
Well, even when I was younger, there was an entity that was developed, I think it was probably even back in the 70s or 80s. They had rural medicine. So in other words, if you graduated out of a certain residency, internal medicine or family practice, primary care, that you were given an incentive to practice in a rural area for a while, and then you could move on. You could go to your New York City, you could go to your Chicago or wherever. It still exists, but I think we need to revitalize it. I think we need to refund it in a much more robust way, because once you give the incentive for those people, there are younger people that are like, yeah, I'd really like to go and do something worthwhile. Obviously, there's some people that are like, well, but I grew up in New Jersey and I don't want to move. You're always going to have that. But there are people that are willing to go to rural areas. It has to be an economic reality for them to do that, because they have all these loans. There are some medical schools, I believe it's NYU, that just made their medical school free. The catch is they drastically reduced their class size. So there's not going to be as many people graduating from that each class, which it's a step in the right direction, but I think that if you refund those programs, those rural outreach programs, you're going to get more people into those rural areas. And it's not just primary care. It brings up the whole thing that I brought up before, the opioid life or death issue. I want to have a new specialty. I want to have a chronic pain specialty. We have subspecialties in pain management. But I want to take it out of the hands of internal medicine family practice to a degree. I'm not sure that we need to get rid of pain clinics. We need to have the pain clinics still in place that are grandfathered in. But we need to have really a managed chronic pain specialty that's in partnership with pharmacy, with the pharmacists and everything else. So they're on the right track. They're not overdoing the opioid issue. They're full scope, maybe including psychiatry. And I bring that up because we need those out in the rural areas too. We need chronic pain clinics. We have farmers with chronic pain, and some of them develop opioid issues and things like that because they have chronic back issues. I mean, I have a chronic back issue myself, but I'm not on any opioids for it. I mean, I do what I can to do it in a naturopathic way. So we need definitely primary care clinics, like you said, and we need chronic pain clinics out in the rural areas, and we have to fund it. It's a priority. So,
and this leads pretty well because it's jobs tends to be one of the things that always comes up in any election, especially in some of these rural communities that had a lot of manufacturing at one time. It was a very, very sort of one-dimensional work environment for a lot of folks. Those days have kind of gone by the wayside, and the jobs aren't as well paying, and you have some of these different factors in play now that maybe weren't in play before. And how do you sort of loop jobs into the conversation in terms of because that's what you need first before you can really sort of strengthen the healthcare system, right?
Well, I think it's a segue into. There's two aspects to that. One is if you bring healthcare is a huge employer in the United States. If you look at the total number of people that are employed in healthcare, it's massive. So if you get more healthcare into the rural areas, you are going to create clinics, you're going to create maybe small mini urgent care centers. You're going to create jobs that way. And if you think about it, imagine doing that all over the country in all the rural areas. Just that alone is going to be a job stimulus for sure. And those are usually pretty good paying jobs. But on the other side, I'm going to tie something into global warming. And that has to do with rural areas also. There's a lot of people who live in rural areas that were one company towns, and the one company moved out and now it's dead. And so they have to drive many, many miles to go to work, sometimes to Cornell, sometimes to other big employers. And they drive 20, 30 miles, 40 miles. I know, like my dad, when I was in college, we drove 50 miles. That's why I did so good in my first year of college, believe me. 50 miles each way, 100 miles a day, just to go to school, and for him to go downtown where he lived in the suburbs, to go downtown to work as he was an accountant and executive for an English muffin company, Bay's English Muffins. You might see him in the store. And so we're contributing to global warming that way. People need to live where they work. More people need to live where they work because transportation is one of the biggest aspects of global warming. Transportation of trucks and transportation of people going to and from work, their commute. And so if you have these clinics, if you have at least a company or two that we can bring back and convince Cuomo and the legislator to not tax us out of the state for businesses and reverse that. In other words, like I said before, we were talking before about funding healthcare, funding Medicaid. There are alternative ways to do all those things and not tax people out of the state. And when you start to do that, you can start bending the curve to like bringing some of those companies back to upstate and to other areas. And that will reduce the commute, that will reduce global warming, and you'll also have more employment. There were really good companies for a long time in upstate New York where people worked. And it dried up. And it dried up partly because of the financial atmosphere for those companies. So if we can reverse it, it's going to take the state, this is a federal office, but it's going to take the state to get their act together and realize you can't tax people out of the state.
How, there's always a lot of focus on finding newer, different ways to help the ag industry, in particular here in the Finger Lakes, Western New York, and the Southern Tier. That has been obviously a primary focus in your campaign. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about what that means and how you want to, or how you see best to approach that issue.
Right. I went to the Farm Bureau meeting for like 2.5 days. People were kind of looked at me like, "What are you doing here? Like, you're not a farmer. You're an oral surgeon, you know." And I wasn't actively campaigning, but I was really getting a pulse. I'm not retired, so I have traveled and gone to some farmers. Tracy has gone to a lot of farms, Tracy Matrano. But after talking to a lot of farmers, it's a big spectrum. There's a spectrum of farms that are really successful and doing well, and then there's the farms that aren't doing so well. And I did get a little bit from some, it's not a blame game, but I did get a little bit of an earful of some of the farmers that said, some of these farms that are failing and are not doing good, some of them are failing for many reasons. But one of the high reasons, the top reasons was continuing education and how to make your business more efficient. Whether it's technology, technology was the biggest piece, and some of them have not kept up with that. And I know Cornell Cooperative Extension does some work with that with those farms, but we really need to expand and help the farms where the main focus is their financial instability. We need to help them get back on track in an aggressive way, because we cannot lose those farms. And, it has been brought up that the suicide rate for some of those farmers has really, gone up out of the roof, just like with military veterans. I'm a vet. It's pretty pervasive for veterans. They come back and they have PTSD and all kinds of other things. So we need to address those factors, but the financial factors is what leads some of them to depression and some of them to like giving up on their farms. So continuing education is a big part. I do think like things like milk pricing really needs to be looked at again. It's been the way it has been for years. It's kind of funny, and not everybody's on the same piece of paper with this, but I kind of think that maybe milk pricing should just go to like any other kind of product that you buy in the store. If a farmer wants to charge whatever they want to charge for their 100-pound weight, they should be able to do that. And the problem is you've got some of these big, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization. It's a big co-op. It's the biggest co-op out there. I'm flaking on the name. They were actually at the Farm Bureau meeting with a big spread with all their donuts and the coffee and all the kind of stuff. And yet NPR did a whole story on how they're squeezing some of these little farms out of business and stuff like that. So I think we need to like look at antitrust or, potential conflicts of interest for some of these co-ops and how they really affect the small farms. We need to have those farms have a fair playing field, actually.
And I want to sort of break into a couple other topics here. You mentioned continuing education, and education has already come up a couple times. What are some of the big roadblocks that you would like to be able to hurdle with the current education system that we have, generally speaking, whether it be K through 12 or whether it be higher education? What are some of the pressure points that you would like to see relieved if elected and given the opportunity?
I've heard mixed opinions, but I know that, a lot of people say, well, junior college, a lot of times it's paid for, but I've met a lot of people that started community college and then all of a sudden couldn't afford to keep going, and now they have this debt and they don't even have their associate's degree. I think the associate's degree is way underplayed in the United States. Everybody talks about 4-year college, let's pay for it. Meanwhile, all these people could be going for associate's degrees, getting a business degree or some other degree, and start a business, or work for a business, work for a startup, whatever. It's really underplayed. I would definitely promote that as a congressperson for this district. We have some really great community colleges here, but I also think, there was this big push for 4-year free college. I think we should have a voucher system for community college and actually just make it like as if you're going to high school. For the people that have at least some minimal qualifications to go to college, they're not going to go there to, necessarily party like I did. Waste your time, spend a lot of money, whatever. I knew what the the end goal of what I was going for. I was serious about going for what I did. The pathway that I got there was painful and difficult because I traveled 100 miles a day to and from school my first year of school, so I didn't have ideal conditions. But for the average person out there, they should have the opportunity to go to community college with little or no cost, and it's still not the way. And at least that would pay for 50% of an undergrad degree or 100% of a 2-year associate's degree. I actually even went to Israel on one trip, a political trip. I talked to Knesset members. People were like, "How did you get in there?" I was like, "I worked my butt off over email and phone to get these meetings." And I think even in Israel, they could benefit from community. They don't do community college in Israel. Mm-hmm. And they could get more people that would be quicker to the job market. And it's not a cost issue in Israel because basically pretty much college is free there. But it is an issue from getting people to the job market and a skilled labor force faster than having to wait for a 4-year degree in some cases. And it's really underdone in this country, really. Mm-hmm.
And is that sort of a natural progression or natural fit given the trends that we've seen in some of the data with enrollment at community colleges across the state? I believe it's Corning Community College recently just unrolled some programs and cut some different programs and classes because of like a 21-ish% decline in enrollment over the last decade. Right. And a lot of other community colleges across the state saw the same thing or similar results. Is that sort of the answer to the trend line that we're now seeing where for one reason or another, folks just aren't embracing community college as it seems would be very typical to approach it if it were such a great option?
I think it's a combination between access, financial ability to go, because they, in some cases they still have to go. If somebody's middle income, it's still going to cost them somewhere between $3,000 to $6,000 or $7,000 to go to a community college, let's say, or at least $3,000 to $5,000 in a year, and they also don't necessarily see the value in getting that associate's degree. There is something to be said also that community college represents almost one of the only ways to get a degree in a more of a blue collar kind of field, right. And we need more people to go into. Germany is a good example of a country that there's the university track, and then there's the so-called trade, track and stuff like that. And we do have a lot of good trade unions that have good programs to go to, but we also have BOCES like for dental hygiene and those kind of things. We need to stimulate more high schoolers, to going into skilled trades and skilled jobs instead of just being a service kind of country. Our country has reverted into this whole service thing. And that's starting to backfire with the automation that you hear about too, because we can't just keep doing it the same way. If we start doing automation for service, where are all those people going to, go for their employment? We have to have some place for those people to work, and there's always a need for trade. Trade unions are an example of a great place, a great resource for people to have a viable vocational career.
One topic that every single congressional race that pops up, talking national security, of course. Border security, national security, foreign affairs. How do you relay in a palatable way these issues without getting sort of lost with the average voter who may not be plugged into? Because that is consistently, when we cover these congressional races, it's one of the things that we see most commonly. The voter does not respond that strongly to these issues, which are obviously incredibly important. Right. And if you're running for Congress, you have to have a policy position on it. Right. How do you approach that conversation, and how do you sort of engage in that discussion when it comes about?
I look at immigration as a big, huge bicycle tire with a bunch of spokes, and there's not one cure-all. And the reason I say that is because on the one hand, you have people that are already here. So you have dreamers. We need to get them official. We need to get them registered as citizens, a much faster pathway to citizenship, which a lot of people are talking about. On the same token, we do have to have some border security where we have to have some concern about some people getting into the country for nefarious reasons. But we also, from a diplomatic standpoint, we have to also really engage other countries that have things going on in their countries that are driving the people to our border. And until we really do that in a friendly but, kind of firm way, friendly and firm somehow, there's just going to be, so those people in those countries really would have no reason to come to our country other than, the United States. It's, there's the American dream, all those things. There's still going to be people who want to do that, but we need to really help those countries get back on their feet. If there's people that are oppressed in those countries, we need to really put pressure on those countries to turn that around. So it's multifaceted. And, it was a couple years ago, there was this whole drive, let's abolish ICE. AOC was abolish ICE. It's not so simple because on the one hand, we need to change the practices for ICE down at the border. On the other hand, most people don't know this. I actually spoke at an Erie County law enforcement panel discussion. It was one of their meetings, and they didn't know. There's about 8 gangs up in Canada that sit right near the border, basically, and they go back and forth. They're called TCOs, Transcontinental Crime Organizations, and they work from Canada, United States, and Mexico. And the chief law enforcement agency in the United States that combats these gangs, they're kind of like MS-13 kind of mentality. They're brutal. And ICE is the chief law enforcement agency that actually tries to keep them under bay from committing crimes, transcontinentally, really. Yeah. And mostly, their job is in the United States. So we need to address law enforcement issues that are related to immigration at the same time. And we do have we have some serious border issues up in the Canadian border, actually, related to TCOs, because they money launder a lot of their drug money into the United States, which allows them to get into much more serious drug crimes by money laundering. Actually, marijuana money is what they do. So, which brings up, we need to kind of decriminalize marijuana, but make it a little harder for them to do their business.
When you look at some of the environmental protections that have been rolled back in recent years, whether it's through funding or staffing or just sort of policy changes, right. What would you like to see change in 2020 beyond in that realm to sort of get the U.S. back on track?
As far as environmental issues, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned before about the commuting issue. So transportation and heating and cooling of private and commercial buildings are a large part of global warming, and the problem with global warming. So in order to address those things, we need to reduce the commute for people, have people work where they live. That's a big, huge issue. We need to do even small projects for people's homes, better insulation, more geothermal projects in areas of the country that it could be adapted to. My dad had geothermal and was pretty low cost when he first bought his house. He had heat sink technology, so he had a furnace, but it rarely went on, and so that was his house was very energy efficient. So there's novel things that we can do. We can actually have not just solar to run an entire house, but we might have small solar projects by companies like, we have Renovus in Ithaca that does large and small scale projects. We need to expand that all over the country so that, let's say you want to just run a hot water heater on solar or something like that. Hot water heaters themselves, I think the statistic is for every state that does solar technology that theoretically for running hot water heaters for residential, it's something like you reduce 600,000 cars, the equivalent of the emissions from 600,000 cars. It's an enormous amount. So even just doing small scale projects, we can't lose sight of the fact that we want to do these bigger scale projects, but we should still concentrate on the small scale. And from one other tidbit, I'm not a real big person about a national grid or things or regional grids, because I think even with cyber terrorism and some other issues, we run the risk of having entire grids go down. I'm more into like maybe having neighborhood grids, which would make more sense, because if one grid goes down, it's not a big loss for an entire area. So we have to be really careful how we think about that, because there's people up in the bean counters in Washington that, maybe want to do these regional grids, and it might be unsafe to a degree.
It's interesting you say that, because we have seen, using the solar village in Geneva as an example, we've seen some pretty good steps in terms of what's possible when we combine these smaller grids with the solar move. My last issue question for you before we wrap up today, the Second Amendment. Where do you come down on the Second Amendment? It's always a really tough topic. It tends to get a little bit hostile at different times, depending on who you're talking to. Walk us through where you land on the issue of the Second Amendment.
Right. I was at a meeting. Tracy and I were asked questions about Second Amendment, and she said that she had inherited guns, and from her father, and she had two stepsons in law enforcement in Chemung County. And I said, okay. I grew up hunting. I'm Jewish, so I actually gave up hunting because I didn't even know as a kid that you weren't supposed to do that. But I used to go pheasant hunting with my dad, and I went deer hunting when I got older. I gave it up and it wasn't a big deal. I love bench rest shooting. I love shooting in general. I grew up with guns, and then when I got into the Army, I shot the howitzer. I got to do that. That was like not like huge training. I shot the M4, and I trained extensively with 9mm inside and outside the military, and it's an ongoing thing. And I think what's ironic is there's no mandatory training courses in all of the counties of New York State for concealed carry, but yet you have to have a hunter safety course. So there's some inconsistencies there. There's also an inconsistency that I see. Anytime you say anything negative about guns and you encounter somebody who's a really huge NRA fan, let's say, or whatever. And by the way, I joined the NRA just to get their bulletins to see what they were about. I got into almost a shouting match with the director for the New York when I brought up this next point. I said police officers get screened, psychological screening questionnaires before they get employed. We don't even have that for the random person that wants to buy a gun or get concealed carry. And so I just see it as just a way of maybe a soft screening for people. They do it for law enforcement, so why can't we do it for civilians? It's, we want to try to keep guns out of the hands of people that absolutely shouldn't have them. It gets into a little dicey area because people get really offended. They say, I don't want to have anybody have anything to do with that. But we're at the point right now where, can we avoid some lone wolf kind of person getting their hands on guns? There's other avenues. There's social media. There's inner circles. But you're always going to run into a problem like we saw in Las Vegas. This guy in Las Vegas had almost no social media presence. And so nobody really knew him very, very closely. Mm-hmm. You're not going to stop probably somebody like that. The way you're going to stop somebody like that is through just personal encounters. Like if somebody just doesn't seem right and there's something definitely objectively going wrong. I know some people object to the red flag law, again, on the far side of conservatism for gun ownership and gun laws. But we have to be reasonable about it. I don't think we're not going to solve the problem in any one good solution, but we have to do some little things to at least tweak it so that we get to a point where we have less people having their hands on guns that shouldn't have their hands on guns. And things change, too. It's dynamic. Mm-hmm. Just because you go 20 years, I look at myself, like, what if I started getting Alzheimer's, or what if I started having some kind of dementia or something like that? I would want to disavow all the guns that, whatever. I wouldn't want to have any guns because that's, and that doesn't usually happen suddenly, but even if it does, that's something to take into account. Just because you were okay one year doesn't mean you're okay another year. So it needs to be a little give and take, and people need to be reasonable about it. But on the other hand, as far as background with, Second Amendment and being around guns and stuff like that, I think I'm definitely the candidate that's probably the most trained in that area.
And obviously we're still very early in the process, but where can folks learn more about your campaign? and learn more about you on the issues.
The website is scottnorenforcongress.com. I would love to, it's a little bit last minute for signature gathering, but if anybody wants to volunteer to get to pass ballot, get petition signatures, I'd welcome that. Obviously, getting donations really helps because my campaign is definitely underfunded compared to the two other campaigns. And they can always email me with questions at scottnoren23@gmail.com.
All right, Scott, appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us this hour on Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and we'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, download the FingerLakes1.com app to have the latest local breaking news, alerts, and podcasts delivered right to your hand each and every day. Follow and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy the program and can support us, head over to patreon.com/FL1 to pledge monthly support. If you have an idea for a show or simply want to let your voice be heard, drop us an email or leave us a voice message by visiting InsideTheFLX.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you back here next week.